I have never believed that evenings begin with intention. They unfold instead like the slow turning of a page one had forgotten was marked. And that night near Magdalen Bridge proved no different. I had drifted into the king's arms more out of habit than thirst, yet the pint placed before me had already surrendered its warmth by the time I lifted it. Rain pressed faintly against the window panes, a muted tapping that seemed almost shy of being heard. Oxford often behaved like that in late term, full of secrets, reluctant to confess them. It was the hushed tone at the next table that disturbed the comfortable anonymity of the room. A lecturer, grey-suited and earnest in the way only those who have lectured too long can be, leaned across to a student whose shoulders had the angular tension of someone absorbing more than advice. I caught only fragments, drifting between the scrape of chairs and the half-hearted laughter of undergraduates, the shadows returning. You must be careful. The past never sleeps here. Most conversations in Oxford are padded with the kind of dramatics that evaporate by morning, yet something in the lecturer's cadence lingered. Not urgency, exactly. More the tremor of a man speaking to someone he feared would not listen. I looked back at my pint. A thin ring of foam clung stubbornly to the rim, refusing to disappear. I envied it for a moment. Lewis would have said that I was imagining significance because the evening offered none of its own. He is wrong about that. Even an idle remark can contain a seed of consequence, buried so deep that only hindsight allows one to recognize the first stirrings. I finished the pint without enjoyment and stepped into the wet night. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle, the sort that glosses the cobblestones and blurs the outlines of bicycles leaning like sleepy animals against the walls. Magdalen Bridge exhaled cold air from the river beneath, the kind that climbs into one's bones with quiet persistence. I turned toward St. Swithin's College without thinking. Many of my walks end in places I have no intention of reaching. The college stood as it always did, aloof, its windows throwing out rectangles of yellow that made the darkness between them feel purposeful. Ivy clung to the stone like old gilt. The gate was half open, its ironwork glistening. A bicycle lay beside it at an odd angle, as if its rider had forgotten whether they were arriving or fleeing. Water gathered beneath the frame, trembling with each raindrop. I paused. People in Oxford rarely abandon bicycles so carelessly. They're too often the sole partners in their wanderings. Yet the sight felt no more than a small discord, the sort one notes and stores away with no expectation of retrieval. I entered the quad. The air smelled of damp earth and the faint starchiness of candle smoke wafting from some unseen corridor. A solitary light glimmered from the porter's lodge where the old man, Harrington, I believe, stood bent over a ledger with the reverence of a priest examining Holy Writ. My footsteps echoed faintly, and he looked up with a nod that seemed to acknowledge not me, but the inevitability of someone appearing at that hour. I walked on, letting the ancient hush of the place draw me in. The cloisters were almost too quiet. Even the rain seemed reluctant to intrude. I have always trusted silence more than speech. It reveals more. On evenings like that one, the air had a curious weight to it, as though some story hovered just beyond articulation. Around the final column, I saw Harrington again. He had followed me, or perhaps merely completed his round. His torchlight skimmed the flagstones and caught on something dark near the wall. He bent, lifted it, hesitated. A coat, heavy wool, dark, faintly slick from the damp. He held it with the care one grants an object that does not belong in the present moment. I asked if someone had left it behind. Harrington shook his head almost imperceptibly. The coat had no companion, no umbrella, no bag, no man walking briskly back to retrieve it before the rain claimed it entirely. Just the coat lying quietly against the stone as though its owner had stepped out of it and dissolved into the night. The porter murmured, more to himself than to me, that he could swear he had heard footsteps earlier, a hurried rhythm swallowed by the storm. But when he followed the direction of the sound, there had been nothing except the coat and an impression in the wet ground that resembled the beginning of a trail, and then vanished. He folded the garment over his arm, unease flickering across his otherwise impassive features. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the subtle shift between an ordinary evening and something darker, something patient. Oxford keeps its secrets well, too well. But now and again, one of them leaves a small offering at your feet, inviting you to listen. And that night, under the cloisters of St. Swithin's, it seemed I had begun to hear the faintest echo of footsteps that had no business disappearing. I woke the next morning with a vague heaviness that often follows an evening spent wandering without purpose, as though the mind collects moisture just as the air does. Lewis phoned before I had properly assembled myself. His voice carried that familiar reluctance, the kind that suggests a matter too small for alarm, yet too strange to ignore. A tutor at St. Swithin's had vanished, he said, and the college would be grateful for a discreet visit. I remember thinking that colleges seldom seek assistance unless the threads have already begun to fray. The drizzle had hardened into a thin, relentless rain by the time I reached St. Swithin's. The porter's lodge smelled faintly of damp wool and old paper, two scents that have accompanied more investigations than I care to count. Harrington offered a terse nod, as though continuing a conversation left hanging in the air from the night before. He led us to the tutor's staircase, speaking softly, the way one does when the walls have grown accustomed to listening. Dr. Adrian Bexley's rooms were painfully orderly, as though tidiness might have been the final defense against something encroaching. A half-finished crossword lay on his desk, the ink still sharp in its clarity. One 8-letter entry had been filled in, Umbra. I traced a fingertip across it, feeling the slight impression in the paper. Lewis glanced over my shoulder and wondered aloud whether the word held any relevance. Shadow, I murmured. Not the kind cast by light, more the kind that grows from memory. His wardrobe stood open, its contents untouched, no hurried gap suggesting luggage pulled out in panic or haste. On the small table beneath the window lay a letter addressed to the master of the college. The envelope had not been sealed. I lifted it, expecting something dramatic or at least explanatory. Instead, I found a single line about absenting himself briefly to pursue a matter of academic interest. The phrasing was oddly formal, even for an Oxford don, something rehearsed as though it had been written to satisfy expectation rather than truth. Lewis moved toward the staircase and called me over. A faint smear of dried blood traced the lower edge of the newel post. Not enough to signal violence, merely enough to unsettle the mind. A man could easily cut himself on these old wood carvings, Lewis said, though he did not sound convinced. I noted the height of the smear, too low for someone tall like Bexley to brush against without noticing. I stepped back into the room. The rain pressed against the window with insistent fingers. The college grounds below looked washed of color, leaving only shapes and outlines, as though the day itself were reluctant to commit to being present. I picked up the crossword again. Umbra. It struck me, not as a revelation, but as a mild irritation. The clue number had been filled in with an incorrect numeral. Bexley was meticulous. He would never mislabel a row. Something must have interrupted him mid-thought, something close enough to reach him while he still held the pen. We spoke with the master shortly afterward. He maintained a calm that felt brittle. He assured us that Dr. Bexley had a habit of withdrawing without notice, pursuing obscure fragments of scholarship that required solitude. Yet his eyes shifted when I asked whether the tutor had seemed troubled of late. People in authority often believe their evasions are delicate. They seldom are. On our way out, Lewis remarked that a missing person without evidence of foul play left us with little to begin on. But absence itself is a clue, I replied, though I wasn't sure he heard me over the patter of rain striking the stone courtyard. I caught sight of the bicycle still leaning near the gate, its tire now half submerged in a shallow pool. No one had reclaimed it, though the hour was late enough for any forgetful owner to feel the loss. Before leaving, I drifted back toward the cloisters, compelled more by unease than duty. The coat Harrington had found was gone, locked away somewhere safe, yet the flagstones seemed to hold the imprint of its presence, darkened slightly, as though memory itself had seeped into the stone. I stood there for a moment, letting the sound of the rain settle around me. There's a kind of silence that grows at the edges of a puzzle, the silence that recognizes the first fracture. A man missing, a letter too formal, a crossword interrupted, and a mark of blood barely enough to matter. None of it was sufficient, but together, arranged quietly in the mind, they formed the outline of something unwelcome. And though I could not yet name it, I felt the cold certainty that a death had already occurred. Only the body had chosen not to arrive. If there is one thing I learned during my years wandering through Oxford's cloisters, it is that scholars rarely vanish alone. They leave behind echoes, conversations paused mid-sentence, grudges sealed beneath politeness, unfinished arguments dressed as collegial discourse. The absence of Dr. Adrian Bexley pressed against the college like a damp draught slipping under a door, not violent but persistent. Lewis and I began with those who claimed to know him best, though in academia that word often means those who envied, admired, or quietly resented in equal measure. I felt the familiar pull of reluctance as we climbed another narrow staircase. The college's older wings always smelled faintly of paper thawing from long disuse, as though books exhaled what humans could not. Dr. Helena Ward greeted us with the composure of someone long practiced at disguising her inner weather. She stood near her fireplace, hands clasped loosely, her gaze steady but measuring. She asked if we had news, though something in her voice suggested she already anticipated disappointment. I told her we were gathering impressions, and she nodded as though impressions were more dangerous than facts. She spoke of Bexley with the controlled admiration one reserves for a rival whose brilliance complicates affection. She described him as incisive, meticulous, occasionally cruel in the way only perfectionists can be. Lewis asked whether she had seen him in recent days. She paused, searching some private ledger, then recalled a conversation about misattributed translations. She mentioned his tone had been unusually gentle. The detail snagged in my mind, not because it carried meaning, but because it felt rehearsed. Kindness recalled with precision is rarely natural. As we left, I noticed a slip of paper on her side table, a crossword torn from a newspaper, a single clue circled in faint pencil. Disappearing act? 6 letters. She had left it incomplete. Scholars seldom abandon puzzles without reason, yet I said nothing. The mind stores what the mouth delays. Our next visit led us to Jonas Merton, a postgraduate whose room bore the unmistakable scent of damp laundry, unfiled research, and disappointment. He sat slouched at his desk, the light casting a tired glow across his features. He insisted he barely knew Bexley, though the edge in his voice betrayed bruised pride. I had seen that tone many times, a scholar defending himself from the memory of a critique that landed too accurately. He mentioned a failed thesis review, a harsh assessment from Bexley that effectively ended his scholarship prospects. Lewis tried gently to inquire whether resentment lingered. Merton shrugged, but the gesture felt too dismissive, too swift to convince. A thin smear of ink stained his wrist, the mark of someone who had been writing hastily. I asked what he had been working on. He muttered something about revising citations. The ink blot on his wrist, however, matched the darker ink Bexley used. A coincidence, perhaps. Coincidences, in my experience, tend to return for clarification. We left him staring at the floor, his shoulders drawn inward as though expecting another judgment to fall. Our final conversation of the afternoon belonged to Fiona Larch, the librarian. Her domain carried the earthy scent of aging bindings and polished wood. She moved through the aisles with the quiet precision of someone accustomed to existing between whispers. Her eyes held a patience that unsettled me. Not indifference, but a kind of sadness that resisted interpretation. She spoke warmly of Bexley's regular visits to the archives, though she avoided specifics when I asked what he had been researching. She said he was troubled lately, though she offered no examples. Her restraint irritated me more than outright falsehood would have. People hide truths gently when they believe the truth might injure someone else. In my experience, that someone is usually themselves. As we walked back toward the quad, Lewis observed that all three suspects had been unhelpfully polite. He meant it as a frustration. I took it as confirmation. Politeness in Oxford is a defensive shield. When someone speaks freely, I rarely learn anything of importance. But when they tread carefully, choosing each word as though it carries weight, there is usually a story pressing against the surface. A bell tolled somewhere deep in the college, its echo stretching across the wet stone. I paused beneath an archway, letting the sound settle. I thought again of the misplaced numeral in Bexley's crossword, the odd courtesy of Helena Ward, the ink on Merton's wrist, and the librarian's fragile quiet. None of it formed a pattern, yet each fragment hinted at someone circling an unspoken truth. And as the evening light thinned across the quadrangle, I felt that subtle shift again. The sense that a man had not merely vanished, but that his absence was part of a conversation still unfolding, one in which every voice was speaking carefully, deliberately, as though the shadows themselves had begun to listen. Some investigations lead you down corridors designed for footsteps. Others guide you toward places meant only for silence. The archives of St. Swithin's belong to the latter. I've never trusted rooms in which time piles itself into corners, but there was no avoiding them. Bexley had spent his final weeks descending this staircase, and I felt compelled to follow whatever faint trail he had left. Lewis clattered behind me with the unintentional earnestness of a man who has not yet learned the value of delicacy in a space built for whispers. The air thickened as we reached the lower level, a mixture of old glue, dust-softened parchment, and the peculiar cold that lingers where sunlight rarely intrudes. I asked the archivist, a narrow man with the posture of a question mark, to show us Bexley's recent withdrawals. He shuffled through a ledger whose pages crackled at each turn. The list was shorter than expected, though each entry belonged to the sort of manuscripts scholars approach with equal parts reverence and hunger. He pointed us toward a table where one such volume still lay open beneath a cloudy reading lamp. I moved toward it with a reluctance I couldn't explain. The manuscript was a medieval commentary whose margins were an eruption of tiny flourishes, as though the original scribe had taken comfort in ornamenting thought. What unsettled me, though, were the annotations added recently, sharp-edged Latin phrases in Bexley's neat hand, each one glancing toward a theme of confession. Lewis leaned in, whispering that he could barely decipher the script. I told him that was the point. Scholars often hide in languages they believe will outlive their mistakes. A faint crease drew my attention. A page had been pressed unevenly, as if someone had turned it back with unusual haste. On its outer margin, half effaced by smudged pencil, lay a fragment of a Latin verse. I recognized it only because I had once attempted a translation in my youth, a poem about truth walking alongside its shadow, indistinguishable until dusk. I traced the line with a fingertip, feeling the paper tremble under the lamp's faint heat. Bexley had not chosen these passages casually. He had been circling something. The archivist asked if we required anything further. His voice carried a tremor, not of fear, but of irritation. Scholars dislike disruption more than uncertainty. I asked whether anyone else had consulted the same manuscripts recently. His hesitation lasted just a fraction too long. "Only the librarian," he finally murmured, though she rarely touched the older volumes unless requested. I folded that detail into the quiet accumulation already forming. Lewis wandered toward a cabinet where several dusty folders had been placed unevenly, as if someone had returned them moments before closing time. One folder bore no label. He handed it to me with the curiosity of a man expecting trivia. Instead, I found an old college photograph slipped between academic reports. The image captured a group of scholars from 2 decades earlier, young faces arranged in the stately discomfort of formality. Near the back stood Bexley, his expression unreadable, the tension of someone sharing a space with ghosts. Beside him was another figure, a student whose name I recalled only distantly. He had drowned in the Cherwell one spring, a death that had passed through the college with the brief formality of sadness institutions adopt when tragedy feels too close. Someone had recently touched the photograph. The edges were free of dust, while the rest of the folder lay untouched for years. I felt the faint, prickling awareness that accompanies connections forming too quietly to name. Lewis suggested the photograph might have been misfiled. I doubted it. Misfilings occur through carelessness, but the positioning of the folder, front of the cabinet, slightly ajar, implied recent use. Someone had come searching for something, then placed it back with a subtle imprecision of guilt. We stepped into the dim corridor outside. The floorboards complained beneath Lewis's weight, but beneath mine, they barely sighed. I paused, letting the quiet settle into its natural shape. The smell of dust and cold parchment clung to my coat like a reminder. As we climbed back toward the surface, Lewis remarked that the manuscripts seemed too esoteric to matter. I told him that if a man spends his final days among forgotten texts, then whatever he seeks is rarely trivial. He nodded, though I sensed he thought me romanticizing. Perhaps I was. Yet one detail persisted, the erased corner of the Latin verse. Someone had rubbed at it. Not enough to destroy the words, only enough to obscure them. A person attempting to hide meaning often reveals more than they intend. Outside, the rain had eased into a thin mist that blurred the college buildings into softened shapes. I looked back through the archway leading down to the archives. The darkness there felt almost alive, as though it held something waiting to be spoken. Shadows do not gather without reason. And that day, in the trembling light of a dusty manuscript, I felt the first hint of what Bexley had been trying to tell someone, perhaps even himself, before the silence claimed him. There are people who move through the world as though their very existence might disturb the dust of old memories. Fiona Larch belonged to that quiet category. When Lewis and I returned to the library the following afternoon, the place seemed to shrink around her. Shelves leaning inward, lamps dimming into deference, the faint musk of aging bindings rising like breath caught between words. She stood near the returns desk, smoothing the corner of a catalogue card with a motion so deliberate it felt like a heartbeat. When she looked up, her expression carried the composed gentleness of someone accustomed to guarding silence. I asked whether she had a moment, and she nodded with that small, polite assent librarians give when they hope the intrusion will be brief. We followed her into a side room lined with forgotten periodicals. The floorboards creaked under Lewis, but not beneath her. She gestured toward 2 chairs with a hesitance that suggested she feared the conversation more than she feared the content of it. I remained standing. I often find that truth reveals itself better when one refuses the comfort of a seat. She spoke of Bexley in tones that hovered between admiration and pity. She said he had seemed troubled in recent weeks, though she could not, or would not, name the source. I asked whether he had confided in her. She hesitated, though not out of deceit. It was the pause of someone searching for a version of events that would not unravel her. "He told me he had made a mistake," she murmured, her gaze drifting toward the window as though she feared the room itself might hear. Not a mistake in judgment, but a mistake of scholarship. Something buried in the past. Something he believed would surface. Lewis asked what the mistake concerned. She pressed her hands together, fingers twisting slightly. He did not say, only that he feared its return. The phrase unsettled me. its rhythm too close to the lecturer's whisper in the pub on the night Bexley disappeared. Shadows returning. I felt the faint tightening behind my ribs, the subtle alignment of two remarks that should have remained unrelated. I asked whether Bexley had visited the archives often. She nodded. Perhaps too often, she added, though she caught herself as if regretting the slip. I asked what he had been searching for. Her eyes narrowed with quiet calculation. She said she did not know. It was unconvincing, not because of her tone, but because of the way she glanced at a shelf behind me. A fleeting, almost instinctive dart of the eyes toward the section that housed personal papers from the college's early 20th century scholars. I filed that gesture away. People reveal themselves not in confession, but in the direction they choose not to look for too long. Lewis attempted reassurance, telling her we were simply trying to trace the tutor's last movements. She offered a faint smile, but it trembled slightly, like a thread pulled too tight. I asked whether she had noticed anyone else behaving unusually. She shook her head, though I sensed the answer held more discomfort than truth. As we left the small room, she followed us back into the main hall. Her steps were soft, measured, as though she feared leaving footprints on the polished floor. When we reached the door, she said something that halted me. He was a good man, Inspector. But good men sometimes carry stories they can't bear to tell. The sentence lingered like a draft through an open window, quiet, chilling, and containing far more than the words permitted. Lewis interpreted it as grief. I recognized something different, a warning wrapped in affection. Outside, the college quad lay washed in a gray light that flattened every surface. I paused beneath the eaves, letting the drizzle form cool patterns along my coat. The photograph from the archives returned to my mind. The drowned student beside a younger Bexley, their expressions caught in the unease of unspoken history. I asked Lewis whether he recalled the student's name. He didn't. Neither did I, not precisely. But memories shifted faintly, as though preparing to surface. We walked toward the lodge. I glanced back at the library windows. Fiona stood behind one of them, barely visible, her outline blurred by glass and rain. She remained still, watching us, her posture carrying the weight of someone who feared not discovery, but recollection. Lewis asked what I thought of her. I told him she was telling the truth. Or rather, the truth she could live with. He frowned, unsure what that meant, and I didn't elaborate. Some people fear crimes, others fear memories. Fiona Larch, I suspected, feared the day the two would become indistinguishable. There are evenings when a man pours himself a glass of wine, not out of pleasure, but out of necessity. That night, the bottle waited on my kitchen counter with the kind of silent companionship I have learned to value more than conversation. I sat by the window, the room dim except for the thin pool of light cast by a lamp whose shade tilted slightly to one side, as though unwilling to commit to illumination. Outside, the rain had returned, soft and persistent, wrapping itself around the city like a forgotten coat. I opened the crossword I had taken from Bexley's desk. The ink marks seemed sharper in my quiet flat than they had in his cluttered room, as though the puzzle had absorbed some of the tension that lingered there. Umbra. I found myself tracing the letters again, wondering whether he had chosen the word or whether the word had chosen him. I began filling the surrounding clues out of habit, letting the patterns settle into the slow rhythm of familiarity. Then I noticed it, the clue beneath the one he had completed. A reference to an ode attributed to Horace, though the wording was off by a single phrase. I had only encountered that misquotation once before, in a lecture years ago, delivered by a tutor more interested in impression than accuracy. Bexley would never have misquoted Horace. So why was the clue written incorrectly? I leaned back, letting the wine warm the edges of thought. Either the crossword setter had erred, Unlikely. Or Bexley had been interrupted mid-solution and filled the wrong clue into the wrong row. It suggested haste or distraction. Perhaps both. Lewis phoned then, his voice carrying the faint static of a man still half at work. He told me the porter had confirmed a visitor had come to the college on the night Bexley disappeared. A name signed into the lodging book, though written hurriedly. The signature, he said, looked like F. Larch. For a moment, I thought the wine had dulled my senses, because the name drifted into my ear with the strange weight of inevitability. Fiona Larch insisted she had not been at the college that night. The porter claimed someone using her name had been. I asked Lewis if the signature looked forged. He said he wasn't sure. The handwriting slanted oddly, as though the writer had been uncertain or unwilling to make the letters stand confidently. Another shadow, pretending to be a person. When I ended the call, the room seemed quieter than before. I stared again at the crossword, the misquoted line, the misplaced answer. A man like Bexley did not write carelessly. Even his guilt, whatever shape it took, would have been tidy. I set the crossword aside and walked to my bookshelf, searching for a battered anthology of classical verse. It had followed me through years of cases like a stubborn companion. I found the Horace Ode easily enough. The authentic line rested on the page with the calm inevitability of truth. The misquotation remained stuck in my mind, repeating itself with the irritation of a pebble inside one's shoe. Someone had repeated that wrong version recently. Of that I felt oddly certain. Language leaves footprints, tone leaves residue. Rain slid down the window pane in slow, uneven lines. Oxford at night takes on the appearance of a city thinking aloud. I decided to walk back to St. Swithin's, more to quiet the restlessness than out of any rational purpose. The college's lights glimmered faintly when I arrived, their glow blurred by mist. Harrington, the porter, lifted his head when he saw me. His expression carried the weary dignity of a man who had outlived too many secrets. He handed me the lodging book without a word. The signature lay near the bottom of the page, a shapeless scrawl that might once have aspired to be a name. The F was too large, the L collapsing inward, as though each letter had been adjusted after the pen left the paper. I asked whether the visitor wore a coat. Harrington frowned at the memory. He believed he had, though the details slipped from him like water through fingers. I watched him search for certainty and fail. The night air outside felt heavier when I stepped back into it. A bicycle bell chimed somewhere in the darkness, then fell silent. I walked toward the cloisters, letting the quiet settle around me. The courtyard glistened, each pool of water reflecting the faint orange lanterns above. My reflection hung in one of them, blurred, fractured, untrustworthy. A familiar sight. As I turned to leave, I felt the smallest tug of recognition at the back of my mind, the kind that arrives unwelcome and refuses explanation. The misquoted ode, the forged signature, the librarian's glance toward the forbidden shelves. Each fragment hovered, refusing connection, yet resisting dismissal. Some truths do not approach directly. They circle, waiting for a moment of stillness to reveal themselves. And that night, beneath the rain-soaked stone of St. Swithin's, I sensed the first shift in the air, no louder than a page turning, no brighter than the lamp I had left burning at home. If there is a trap I fall into more readily than I care to admit, it is the temptation of an early theory, one that glimmers with the seductive neatness of logic, but collapses the moment a stray fact wanders into view. That morning, with a tired sun struggling through the college haze, I believed I had stumbled into something resembling clarity. Lewis arrived at my flat with the hesitant eagerness of a man hoping for direction. He carried a folder of notes, each page scribbled upon in his dutiful, slanted handwriting. He told me Jonas Merton's alibi seemed solid, though the young man's agitation still troubled him. I asked whether any of Merton's discarded notes had been recovered. Lewis nodded, offering me a small bundle of torn pages extracted from the college bins. The handwriting struck me immediately. Sharp, hurried, almost frantic. Lines of argument abandoned mid-sentence, references crossed out with impatient strokes, the remnants of a thesis fraying at its edges. I found a single note that made me pause, a margin comment written in a different ink, perhaps older, perhaps borrowed from another text. The phrase read simply, "He knows too much." I asked Lewis whether Merton admitted writing it. He shook his head. The student claimed ignorance. We walked back to St. Swithin's, our steps echoing in the long corridor leading toward Merton's room. The morning light slanted through narrow windows, filling the passage with a muted chill. I felt the beginnings of a shape forming behind the facts, as though some unseen hand were sketching an outline I had not yet deciphered. Merton opened the door with the resignation of someone expecting interrogation. I told him plainly, more plainly than tact usually allows, that his resentment toward Bexley seemed palpable. He didn't deny it. He muttered that Bexley had ruined years of effort with a single review. When Lewis asked where he had been on the night of Bexley's disappearance, he repeated his alibi without hesitation, a late tutorial with 3 fellow students. They confirmed it, he insisted. And indeed they had. Yet something felt off. His room was too chaotic to be the domain of a man capable of leaving no trace. Disorder leaves fingerprints, guilt leaves patterns. His bore neither. Still, my mind arranged the pieces with restless determination. Bexley's harsh critique, Merton's ruined prospects, the mysterious annotation in the archive, the forged signature in the lodge. It was almost coherent. Almost. Lewis noticed my silence as we walked back across the quad. He asked whether I had found something persuasive. I told him I'd found something tempting. Temptation in detective work is merely another form of error. We stopped near the cloisters where the coat had been found. The stone felt colder than usual beneath my hand. I asked Lewis to imagine a scenario in which Merton confronted Bexley, anger sharpened by academic, humiliation, an argument escalating, an accident turning into something construed as malice. Lewis considered it, nodding slowly, the theory appealing in the way all simple narratives appeal. But simplicity in Oxford often masks the absence of truth. A sudden gust rattled the ivy against the wall, scattering droplets across the flagstones. I thought again of the misquoted Horace ode in the crossword. A subtle mistake, but deliberate. Merton, with his fragmented thesis and uneven scholarship, could not have misquoted Horace so elegantly. Nor would he have recognized the significance of the manuscript annotations in the archive. His anger was loud. The puzzle before me required quiet. We returned to the lodge before leaving the college. Harrington, polishing his spectacles with the reverence of a museum curator tending a relic, told us no other visitors had been recorded. His tone suggested finality, but the register on his desk told another story. The pages before the forged signature bore faint indentations of erased names. Someone had attempted to rewrite the past, line by careful line. I traced the indentations with my thumb, feeling the grooves like faint scars. The erased signatures were too uniform to belong to different hands. Someone had tampered with several entries, not just the one. Someone who understood how easily paper bends to deception. As we stepped into the grey afternoon, I felt the weight of my earlier theory collapsing gently, like a sand castle losing its form with the first retreating wave. Merton was angry. Yes. Resentful, certainly. But his emotions were too transparent to conceal the intricacies of what Bexley had been entangled in. Lewis asked whether the theory still held. I told him it held about as well as a poem translated twice by different scholars, each believing they had captured the original. He gave me that small, confused frown he often wears when I drift too close to metaphor. The truth remained just beyond reach. visible enough to tease, hidden enough to taunt. And I felt, with that familiar ache, that the case had begun to turn not on what had been said, but on what had been preserved in silence. There are objects that announce themselves with such quiet insistence that one feels almost impolite ignoring them. The diary Lewis brought to my flat that evening belonged to that peculiar category. He placed it on my table with the caution of a man handling something both delicate and accusatory. A thin, weathered volume, its edges softened by years of disuse, its spine cracked in precisely the manner that suggests secrets were once bent into it. He said they'd found it boxed away in one of the unused college storerooms, mixed in with student belongings from long before either of us had joined the force. I asked him how it had resurfaced. He shrugged. Someone must have moved things recently, sorting the abandoned from the forgotten. The name on the inside cover halted me more than the book itself. Recognized it faintly, an echo from St. Swithin's older tragedies. A student who had drowned in the Cherwell 2 decades ago, a death that drifted through the college records with the detached solemnity of an unfortunate footnote. I traced the name with my thumb, feeling the brittle texture of the paper beneath. Lewis watched me with that mixture of curiosity and caution he often adopts when he senses I have stepped into the past rather than the present. He asked whether I remembered the case. Only in fragments, I told him. A spring flood, an unstable bank, a life carried downstream. That was the official explanation. The unofficial one, whispered among older dons, hinted at something more complicated. Rivalries, pressures, unspoken tensions that can shift the course of a life as easily as any current. The diary entries began innocently enough. Lectures, sleepless nights, scraps of poetry copied in earnest imitation. Then, halfway through the volume, the tone changed. The handwriting grew erratic, the lines compressed, the ink pressing harder into the page. I felt myself leaning closer, as though the pages might unfold their meaning only to someone willing to share their claustrophobia. The final entry had been torn out entirely. Only the ghost of it remained, pressure marks etched faintly into the paper beneath. At first glance, they resembled nothing more than the impression of hurried writing. But when I angled the page beneath the lamp, shadows formed within the grooves, revealing the outline of words. They emerged reluctantly, like survivors from a flood. He said the shadows speak truth. The phrasing struck me not only for its unease, but for its echo. Bexley's crossword, Fiona Larch's murmured anxieties, the lecturer in the pub speaking of shadows returning, a phrase wandering across decades, choosing new mouths to inhabit. I felt Lewis watching my expression, though he refrained from interrupting. I asked him whether anyone had handled the diary recently. He said the archivist claimed it had been untouched for years. Archivists, I have learned, remember books but forget boxes. Someone had opened this volume not long ago. The faint smudge of newer oil along the edge of the torn page suggested as much. I closed the diary gently, as though afraid to disturb whatever rested between its covers. We walked back to the college to examine the storeroom where it had been found. The corridors were dim, lit by lamps whose glow spread reluctantly across the floor. Dust rose beneath our footsteps, swirling like disturbed breath. The room itself held the stale smell of forgotten years, cardboard softening at the corners, old clothing sealed in outdated plastic, piles of notebooks stacked unevenly. Lewis pointed to the shelf where the diary had been discovered. I noticed something he had missed. The thin layer of dust surrounding the spot bore a single disturbance, as though someone had brushed it aside with the back of a hand. Not recently, but not long ago either. I asked Lewis when Fiona Larch last accessed this storeroom. He frowned, uncertain. Librarians, he said, didn't usually involve themselves with old storage spaces. I did not contradict him. Some truths do not require interruption. On the way out, we passed the college's notice board, a mosaic of announcements, essays, requests for tutors. One flyer caught my attention, a memorial lecture on historical academic misconduct. The speaker's name was unfamiliar, but the title tugged at something: hidden errors, unseen consequences. I felt the faint click of alignment, though its meaning remained elusive. We stepped into the quad. A thin mist rose from the grass, spreading itself between the buildings like a quiet assertion. Lewis asked whether the diary changed anything. I told him it changed nothing, and yet altered everything. He sighed, accustomed now to my answers that sounded paradoxical until they weren't. As we left the college behind, the evening settled into a deeper shade. I carried the diary under my arm, its weight disproportionate to its size, like a voice that should have faded years ago, but instead lingered, waiting for someone to hear it again. There are moments in an investigation when the mind, exhausted by ambiguity, latches on to an answer not because it is true, but because it is tidy. I have fallen into that trap more times than I care to recount. And on that muted afternoon at St. Swithin's, with the mist clinging to the arches like an old habit, I felt myself wandering dangerously close to a solution that arrived far too willingly. Lewis and I met the master in his study, a room that smelled of pipe smoke long since faded and the faint tang of leather bindings warming beneath lamplight. He sat behind his desk with the serenity of a man accustomed to guiding problems away from the college's surface. His expression, however, betrayed strain. I noticed the way he steepled his fingers, not in contemplation, but in defense. He asked whether we had progressed. I told him the diary complicated matters. His gaze flickered, the smallest twitch, like a candle wick bending toward a draught. He suggested it was best not to linger on tragedies from decades past. Academic communities thrive on forward motion, he said. The past is a burden institutions cannot afford to carry indefinitely. I found the phrasing curious, too polished to be spontaneous. Lewis asked whether he had known the drowned student. The master sighed in a way that suggested both weariness and convenience. He claimed only a passing acquaintance. He remembered the boy's quiet manner, the unfortunate accident, the sadness that had settled briefly over the college. Then he added something almost too gently: "These things happen." It was the wrong tone, not heartless, not evasive, simply rehearsed. I felt the first stirrings of a theory forming, one that wrapped itself around the master like a cloak made of old mistakes. A man in his position could have hidden misconduct. A man fearful of scandal might have buried far more than secrets. The forged signature in the lodge book, the altered manuscript entries, the diary reappearing at such a convenient moment. They could all point to a senior figure determined to preserve the college's immaculate facade. I told Lewis as much when we stepped back into the quadrangle. He looked at me with a subdued hopefulness of someone relieved that the path ahead seemed finally visible. He asked whether we had our man. For a brief, misguided moment, I believed we did. We walked through the cloisters, the stone cool beneath our feet. Somewhere above, a bell struck the hour, its echo drifting downward in long, wavering notes. I allowed myself to imagine a narrative that fit. A master correcting past errors through quiet manipulation, obscuring connections between a drowned student and a tutor unraveling 2 decades later. It was elegant. Too elegant. Then I stopped walking. Across the quadrangle, on a narrow bench beneath the shadow of a climbing rose vine, I noticed something that unsettled me more than any contradiction of fact. A portrait, one of the older photographic plates displayed in the corridor behind the chapel, had been recently moved. I had passed it dozens of times without giving it a second glance. Now, the shift revealed itself with startling clarity. The image captured a college garden party from decades earlier. Bexley stood in the back row. Beside him, the drowned student. and near the front, almost lost among the clustering scholars, a young woman with a locket resting at her collarbone, an oval pendant I had seen before, though I could not immediately place where. Lewis followed my gaze and asked what I had seen. I didn't answer. Instead, I stepped closer to the photograph hanging in the corridor, tracing the outline of the locket with my eyes. The shape was distinctive. An older design, the kind passed from parent to child. I had noticed it days earlier, glinting faintly at Fiona Larcher's throat as she arranged books with her habitual carefulness. It struck me then, not with the force of revelation, but with the quiet inevitability of a page turning. The locket was identical, not merely similar, identical. My theory, so neatly arranged, so temptingly complete, wavered like a curtain disturbed by breath. The master had little reason for such subtle disguise, but a woman carrying her father's memory, guarding the remnants of a family wound, might tread far more carefully. Truth, for her, would not be an abstract burden. It would be a scar she had inherited long before this case began. Lewis asked again what I had noticed. I told him nothing yet, nothing certain. He frowned, puzzled, but did not press. He has learned that my silences often speak only to me. As we stepped back into the cool air outside the chapel, I realized that the solution I had clung to for an hour had dissolved almost as softly as fog, leaving a window pane. The pieces rearranged themselves, quietly refusing the order I had given them, and somewhere behind us, through the half-open library door, I thought I heard the faint creak of floorboards, light, hesitant, like the footsteps of someone who feared her own proximity to the truth. There comes a point in every investigation when the silence around a truth grows heavier than the truth itself. I felt that weight the following evening as I walked the narrow lane toward the librarian's cottage, a modest building tucked just beyond the college boundary, its windows faintly lit, as though unsure whether to invite company or refuse it. The mist had thickened, softening the outlines of the hedges, and each footstep seemed to fall in a world slightly removed from the one I'd occupied that morning. Fiona Larch answered my knock with a stillness that told me she had known I would come. She stepped aside without speaking, allowing me into a sitting room lined with books whose spines had faded into near anonymity. A kettle hissed faintly in the adjoining kitchen, though she made no move toward it. She stood near the mantelpiece, one hand drifting to the locket at her throat, a gesture so unconscious, so instinctive, that it felt less like ornament and more like confession. I told her I had seen the photograph in the chapel corridor. Her shoulders tightened, the smallest contraction, like someone bracing for a wave she had spent years trying not to acknowledge. She murmured that she had hoped it had been moved elsewhere. I asked whether she wished the past to stay lost. She closed her eyes briefly, as though steadying herself. "The past does not stay lost, Inspector," she said. "It waits." There was no accusation in her voice, only the quiet fatigue of someone living at the edge of something she can neither name nor outrun. I asked her whether she had visited the college on the night Bexley vanished. She hesitated, a flicker of resistance crossing her features, then admitted she had. She said she had gone to speak with him privately. Not in anger. She emphasized this with a small shake of the head, but in the worn-out hope that the truth he carried might finally be spoken aloud. I remained silent, letting the room shape her words. She paced once, slowly, her fingertips grazing the back of a chair. She said Bexley had been restless for weeks, unable to work, unable to sleep, drawn into the archives as though searching for absolution. He told her he had uncovered evidence about her father, Frederick Larch, that contradicted the official explanation of the drowning years ago. A falsified exam report, a rivalry turned malicious, a decision that cost a young man his future and eventually his life. She said Bexley believed he had played a part in concealing it. He feared the truth returning, feared it would destroy not only his legacy but her last memory of her father. I asked her whether she believed him. She did not answer. Instead, she sank into a chair, the locket slipping from her fingers. She told me she had asked Bexley to explain himself, but his words tangled into apology rather than clarity. He tried to hand her something, a folder perhaps, or a letter, but she recoiled, saying she was not ready to read the past in his handwriting. She stepped back. He moved toward her as though to reassure. The stone stair behind him was slick from the rain drifting through the open archway. She said he slipped. Not dramatically. Not violently. Simply misjudged the step and fell the short distance onto the corner of the wall. She said the sound had been small, almost polite, as though even death understood the college's need for quiet. She crouched beside him then, calling his name in a voice no louder than breath. She waited for movement, for regret, for anything that would undo what had just unfolded. But Bexley remained still. She touched his cheek. She said she could feel the warmth leaving him like a slow surrender. She looked up at me then, her eyes hollow with something beyond grief. "You think I meant him harm," she whispered. "But I only meant to understand why the past continues to speak even when we bury it." I asked about the forged signature. She nodded, ashamed. She said she panicked, fearing discovery, fearing scandal, fearing that the college would treat her as harshly as it had treated her father. She signed the visitor's book to mislead suspicion, believing she could move the body, hide the evidence, give the man a dignity he never found in life. But she could not carry him. She could not carry anything, not the body, not the truth, not the years of silence. The room felt unbearably small as she finished. Lewis, who had entered quietly behind me, shifted uneasily, unsure where duty ended and mercy began. I asked her where the body was now. She closed her eyes once more. She told us she had left him where he had fallen, unfound only because the college had sealed off the lower cloister for repairs. The walk back to the college was long, though the distance was short. Rain slicked the flagstones, and the lanterns cast their dim circles of light with the indifference of ritual. We found Bexley where she said we would. Later, crossing Magdalen Bridge alone, I listened to the river moving beneath me, steady, unhurried, indifferent to the failings of men. Some truths arrive like accusations, others like shadows. They speak quietly, without triumph or cruelty. And we listen, because in their murmur lies the echo of every mistake we have tried and failed to outrun.